Ja, hallo und herzlich willkommen. Journalismus steht unter Druck, das merke ich als jemand, der Nachrichten präsentiert, als jemand, der recherchiert, der Bücher schreibt, der Artikel verfasst, seit geraumer Zeit, dass bestimmte Themen sehr polarisieren, dass auch wir Journalisten, wenn wir draußen unterwegs sind und als solche zu erkennen sind, auch angefeindet werden, dass auch die Diskussion darüber, was sind Grenzen vielleicht der Berichterstattung, wie sollte man bestimmte Narrative übernehmen oder auch nicht, oder wie geht man mit Fake News um, dass diese Themen immer größer, immer drängender für den Journalismus werden und viele sich auch tatsächlich hier abwenden von klassischen Nachrichten, von den etablierten Medien und sich woanders hauptsächlich informieren, was das mit uns Journalisten, mit unserer Arbeit macht und wie es vielleicht auch in Zukunft weitergehen könnte, wie man auch Vertrauen zurückgewinnen kann. Darüber möchte ich heute mit einem echten Experten in diesem Bereich sprechen, und zwar mit Nic Newman. Er ist Senior Research Associate am Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford. Ich freue mich sehr, dass wir heute miteinander sprechen können. Hi, Nic.
Hi, very good to be with you.
Thank you very much. You recently published a report based on an industry survey about the key challenges and opportunities of journalism in 2025. 326 news executives from 51 countries have responded to the survey, and the findings, I think, are quite remarkable. So, what's the bottom line? What's the state of journalism? Is it rather good, or do we have to deal with a lot of pessimistic challenges?
I think it depends whether you're looking at things from an audience point of view or from a publisher point of view. But from a publisher point of view, it's a bit more bleak than it was a few years ago. So in our survey, only 4 in 10 said that they felt confident about the prospects for journalism, and that is down from about 60% 3 years ago. And obviously there's a lot of things going on, sort of declining engagement, news avoidance. We've got the financial situation. It's much harder to make money online than it was in print or in television. We've got the whole disruption from artificial intelligence, and then just the problems of operating as journalists in an increasingly polarized way, getting access to Gaza or even to the White House, because we've got this sort of rise of alternative media, podcasters and vodcasters who are increasingly taking the place of journalism. So that sense that journalism is losing its raison d'etre, and it is really being bypassed in many ways by politicians.
So we have to differentiate between the environment journalism operates under and the business model, right, the business structure, I'd say. So what are the main threats to journalism's ability to operate freely?
I mean, in terms of the journalism itself, I think one of the biggest trends that we're seeing is the rise of alternative media and the creator economy. And obviously we saw that in the US election, where the main candidates felt it was more in their interest to talk to sympathetic podcasters like Joe Rogan, or even Kamala Harris talked to Alex Cooper, who's a very popular podcaster on the other side, or with audiences that are more sympathetic to the other side. So that bypassing of traditional media rather than sitting down for real sort of scrutiny, independent scrutiny. And we've seen that, I think we're going to see that playbook in many other countries. We've seen it in Romania, with Calin Georgescu, who came from nowhere, used TikTok, talked to podcasters, didn't really do a lot of set piece television or radio, and topped the poll, even though that election's been annulled. So and that just that problem of access, which has been growing for some time, not just around politics, around celebrity, around a whole range of other issues, which is of course affecting journalism's role as the unique gatekeeper to audiences, and as the fourth estate, if you like, that sort of independent group that's keeping everybody honest.
You just mentioned the United States and Romania as examples, but it looks like the way to bypass established media to amplify key messages through creators or bloggers or YouTubers or whoever is out there, that seems to be very effective, right?
It's very effective, and it's partly effective because traditional media doesn't reach whole sections of the population that it used to, and that's obviously partly because so many more people are accessing news via social media, particularly young people with lower educational backgrounds, and previously they would have read the media. So that's why there's some logic to why politicians are trying to talk to podcasters, because they're much more effective, for example, in reaching young men than many news media. So this is partly the fault of news media, which is increasingly talking to elites, because elites are the only ones prepared to pay through subscriptions. And some of the other models around sort of free access are really struggling in terms of advertising, which is affected. And public service media, of course, is under pressure in many parts of Europe. Funding is under pressure, and the audiences are under pressure.
So it looks like it's key to kind of re-engage audiences that have fallen out of the habit of consuming news. But how can we do that?
Well, that's a very good question, and I absolutely don't have all the answers. I mean, part of this is just the fact that news is now competing with so many different sources of entertainment and fun and diversion that it's really hard to cut through, because news is difficult, news is depressing, news brings people's mood down. And when you have one of those amazing mobile phones in your pocket, there's always something more interesting and entertaining to do. So partly the problem is news is getting squeezed by entertainment, infotainment. And it's partly because, trust in institutions, trust in news and trust in journalism is going down. And so that's also feeding into some of the shifts that we're seeing in terms of consumption.
You just said that you see the Trump playbook maybe replayed elsewhere. What exactly do you expect? And is it already happening, for instance, in Europe?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we're seeing parties, non-mainstream parties, particularly on the right, using exactly the same tactics to connect with audiences that they feel are not being properly represented by elite institutions, and that includes, from their point of view, the media. So we see this in Germany, we see the rise of influencers going on now. Of course, it's happening to a much greater extent in the United States than it is in many parts of Europe, because we still have public service media, we still have a much stronger news brand, certainly in much of Northern Europe. So, I think journalism still does play an important role, and it also still sets the agenda in many cases for the discussions that are going on with influencers and in the rest of the media, because most of that content is commentary. It's not really news. It's not really the news gathering side itself. So to some extent, this is, we're thinking more positively, glass half full. Going forwards, then I think that there could be more of a relationship where mainstream media and some of these influencers working together.
Some might now say that we need tougher legislation. What's your stance?
I mean, for what kind of legislation? And what's the problem we're trying to solve would be my stance. I mean, a lot of the people who are using social media, or influencers or podcasters or vodcasters, are using them because they find them more engaging, they find them more entertaining. They would argue that they are representing points of view that have been suppressed by the mainstream media in countries like Germany, for example. And when you're talking about sort of suppressing free speech, then that you get into really difficult areas, as we've seen. We, of course, do see very, very different attitudes towards what is acceptable speech in the United States, where there's sort of very much a sort of free speech absolutist position, and countries like Germany and the UK, for example, where in general there is much more of an appetite to put regulation in. And this is obviously a real flashpoint between the Trump White House and European leaders, but also European populations. I mean, in our data, we definitely show we can see very different attitudes towards where the limits of free speech should be in social media, and whether it requires more moderation or more regulation or both.
You just mentioned the UK as one of the examples where tougher legislation is being discussed. You've seen riots last year in your country, fueled by, criminal cases, and fueled particularly by some people posting online content that's been sparking unrest as well. Right. Has that damaged the acceptance of journalism, the way it was dealt with the phenomenon that people put certain content online and it was being sued?
I mean, I think it was definitely a wake-up call. The riots in the UK, I think, shocked many people, and it's contributed to a much stronger sense that either we need new legislation that then the social media platforms can follow, or we need more moderation or control. I think that's part of the picture. I think the other side of it is sort of literacy within the population about how to handle these kind of things and how to handle what we say and what we don't say in social networks. But these things go hand in hand, I think, and the debate has certainly shifted here and hardened, I think, to want more control, more moderation in these networks.
And then there's another, big thing looming at the horizon. That's AI. It's already part of our work, but it's becoming more and more important, I think. So, what's the prospect? What are the opportunities and what are the challenges with respect to journalism itself? Not the business case, but the work we are doing as journalists.
Well, I think the real concern is an existential one. So, and it's essentially that AI will replace a number of aspects of what is currently done by newsrooms. So, for example, over the next year or two, we're going to see search engines change from being search engines where you get 10 blue links to answer engines where you put in a question around the news or anything else and you get back a story effectively within that interface with maybe a few citations to news websites. So it's looking more like the sort of stories that you would see on a news website. And there's a whole load of AI generated aggregators who are starting to do this. And obviously that is really worrying for news organizations that depend on that search traffic to then monetize through advertising or other methods. And this comes on top of the fact that Facebook and X are sending a lot less traffic to mainstream publishers. So it's around 2/3 decline over the last 2 years from Facebook, about 50% from X. And that has really affected their ability to reach audiences and to make money out of advertising. So this is kind of quite existential. I think at the same time, publishers recognize that there are possibilities of making their content more relevant, to change the formats of that content and to make their workflows much more efficient. So they're really, really worried about one aspect of it, and they're also trying to embrace it on the other side.
So do they need to think about new relationships with big tech companies? Is that one of the possibilities to handle the situation?
I mean, definitely. When we asked publishers in the survey, where are you going to put most of your effort this year? Those AI disruptors, if you like, are right at the top, whether that's Google's AI overviews, whether it's Perplexity, whether it's ChatGPT search, which now has a public version that is connected to real-time news. So what that means, I don't know. I mean, it's a mixture of things. Some media organizations like Axel Springer are doing deals and hoping they're going to get a considerable amount of income from it by essentially allowing exclusive relationships with particular AI companies to use their data. Other ones, are taking completely different approaches to it. But I think, I think the relationship is probably going to be different from the era of social media, which was much more around sort of traffic to websites that they can monetize. This one, I think, is going to be much more around sort of licensing and how can we get a different fair deal from those big companies.
In contrast to the, work environment of journalism, in your study you say on the business side, the prospect, on the contrary, is more optimistic. Why is that? Overall,
I think it's mixed. So publishers, I'm talking to publishers who are in many cases running the P&L or the business side, so they have an interest in being optimistic, I guess. But around 56% said they were optimistic about their business prospects, only 41% saying they were optimistic about the prospects for journalism. And I think a lot of that comes from upmarket newspapers that see a future in digital subscription, essentially. So you see a number of companies around Europe that are increasingly pushing into charging for content directly, so being less dependent on the platforms. Le Monde, for example, a couple of weeks ago, just reminded us that almost the entire cost of the newsroom are now covered by purely the digital subscription. And secondly, how much extra investment they've been able to put into journalism. They've employed many, many more journalists as a result of digital subscriptions. Same for the New York Times, of course. I think for many other publishers, it's a real struggle because the print income is going down. Advertising is very volatile. And as I say, now we have this sort of problem of disruption from AI. So I think it's going to be pretty bumpy. And many media companies this year are certainly looking about further layoffs, as these pressures build.
So subscriptions are more important now than advertisement?
It depends on the company. I mean, I think one of the I think subscriptions really only work if you have content that is unique and distinctive. And obviously there are other models. I mean, public service media is about reaching as many people as possible through whatever platforms you can. And that means that subscription is much less likely. Also, tabloid newspapers like Bild, which are trying to ride two horses, they've got a subscription model, but they're also trying to make sure that there's sufficient free content that they can still keep a whole range of reach. And local newspapers across Europe are really struggling to get people to pay as well. So I don't think it's just going to be subscription. And the other really interesting trend right now is that the business model around television news is also declining. So television audiences are declining. And so CNN, Sky News in the UK, again, really now pushing into trying to add to the free model some kind of premium video offering as well.
So what kind of news product development are publishers prioritizing at the moment? We talked about video, audio. So what's the focus at the moment?
I think the focus in terms of innovation is definitely pushing more into sort of video and audio. So a lot of the innovation is around short form videos, maybe pushing into digital videos that work within platforms like YouTube, which have been growing very fast. YouTube, of course, is increasingly becoming a television platform as well. So underlying in our data, we find that there's an increasing preference to watch things online rather than read them. And so for traditional newspapers that have depended on text, they're going to need to add more video, more audio. Those formats, podcasting being part of that, are also much more engaging. So they kind of build a greater loyalty and time. And I think part of the problem with digital media has been that it's really quite fleeting. People don't need very much time to access a bit of information. And so it's much harder to build businesses off the back of it. And so I think this shift over time into innovation around audio and video is going to be important. I mean, in Germany, you've got, for example, Die Zeit doing for some time doing a lot of podcasts, being a real leader in podcasts, and now adding a separate podcast subscription, as well as bundling it in with the whole operation.
Yeah, we already talked about partisan journalists, independent creators, and so on. How do they change our role as journalists? How impartial can we be compared to 5 or 10 years ago? Because now there is an anticipation that we have to choose sides when we report about certain issues or topics. Is that a problem? Is that something that we can avoid, or is it becoming part of our job?
I mean, there's no question polarization, political polarization has been growing, and polarization of the media is part of that story. Which comes first is a whole question that's hard to prove. But I think what we see when we look at some of the most popular creators in YouTube, for example, is that they are pretty partisan, either from the left or the right, and they are challenging everyone's assumption of what journalism should be, and the impartiality that many of us have grown up with. That impartial journalism was what people wanted. Actually, if you talk to most ordinary people, they still want their media to be fair and balanced and represent different points of view. But of course, in their actions, quite often they do the opposite and are leaning towards commentators and creators who are increasingly partisan. Obviously, you have very, very different media setups. So in the United States, we've always had a partisan television media, and in many cases, and radio media. In many cases, the creators there are just sort of leaning into the same approach. In Europe, we have a much stronger public service ethos and a much greater tradition of impartiality around broadcast journalism in particular. And so these trends are happening a little bit slower. And I think media companies are really thinking, some of them are becoming more partisan to try and build trust with a particular group of people. Others are doubling down essentially on the idea of impartiality and appealing to audiences to stay with them.
But is it a reality that we have to accept at some point, that it's becoming nigh on impossible to report on certain topics in a complete impartial way?
I think what's happened, if you look at the trust scores, for example, for public service media like ARD, like the BBC in the UK, is we have seen people from left and right increasingly distrustful of what those so-called impartial media companies are putting out on issues like Gaza, on issues that they care deeply about, have very strong views about. They see that representation of different views as actually being biased against their particular point of view. So that's definitely played into it. That doesn't mean to say that we should abandon the idea of impartiality. The silent majority is still absolutely in favor of impartial news. They say they want impartial news, and they continue to trust public service media that are independent and trying to do that.
When I'm talking to younger people who like to become journalists, many of them say their motivation is to change things. Something that I find quite astonishing. But that was my motivation when I decided to become a journalist. So what do you think of that?
Absolutely. I mean, when I started being a journalist, I also wanted to change things. I think the question is, which bits do you want to change? For me, the sort of core in terms of the ethics, the accuracy, the being fair to different sides, representing different views, that's sort of core to what I believe as a journalist. And I think a lot of the change that we're seeing actually with some of the young creators is not about the values, it's about the formats, it's about the way in which we present the news, and I absolutely applaud that. I think there's a great need to, tell stories in a different way, to embrace new technologies. There always has been, and I think some of the work we've got a lot to learn from some of the work of creators in being brief, in being very entertaining, as well as informative in the way they put together video, for example, in TikTok.
My last question is, what makes you optimistic, feel optimistic about the future of journalism?
Well, I mean, firstly, that I think in uncertain times in particular, people will always need news. I think AI is not going to be able to AI is very good at repackaging things we already know about, but it can't actually go out and discover what's happening right now. And I think there's something about the humanity of journalism and the connection between journalists who really understand a story or really understand a particular beat. And there's so many powerful ways now to communicate that, different ways of communicating it, different channels to different people in a much more personalized and relevant way. So I'm optimistic about all those things. I'm pessimistic about many other things, but I'm optimistic about journalism as a whole.
Nic Newman, many thanks. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.